They told the world it was under control, that only 31 had died. But they never told you about the children coughing up blood, the soldiers digging their own graves, or the forests that still burn radioactive today. This isn't just a story of a reactor. It's a story of silence, betrayal, and the invisible death that still walks among us. Welcome to Whisper from History, where forgotten truths refuse to stay buried.
Chernobyl, disaster, radiation, lies, and ghosts. April 25, 1986. A cool spring evening settled over the quiet Soviet city of Pripyat. Children played in courtyards, unaware of the invisible danger growing less than 3 kilometers away. Workers at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant were preparing for a safety test routine. On paper, but the air inside reactor for buzzed with tension. Beneath the hum of turbines and blinking control panels, something was wrong. A sequence of decisions, built on arrogance and denial, had already been set in motion. Chernobyl was the pride of Soviet engineering, showcase of nuclear power's promise. 4 reactors stood in a line, capable of generating enough electricity for millions. It was a symbol, not just of energy, but of progress, of dominance. What few people outside the inner circle knew was how deeply flawed the system was. The RBMK reactor design had a dangerous instability, one that Soviet leadership refused to acknowledge. After all, to admit a flaw was to admit weakness, and weakness was not allowed in the USSR. The test that night was meant to simulate a power outage, to determine if the turbines could generate enough electricity to keep coolant pumps running until backup generators kicked in. But delays earlier in the day meant the test would now take place during the night shifts, staffed by the least experienced operators. Key safety systems were disabled. The reactor was already unstable. And yet, the test went ahead. As the clock ticked toward 1:23 a.m., a cascade of fatal errors began. The reactor was operating at dangerously low power, and operators attempted to raise it manually. They removed too many control rods, violating safety protocols in the process. What they didn't know was that the graphite-tipped rods, when reinserted during an emergency, would actually accelerate the reaction. When the AZ5 button was finally pressed intended to shut the reactor down, it triggered a catastrophe. Within seconds, the reactor surged. The first explosion tore through the steel and concrete casing. A second, more powerful blast followed, hurling a 1,000-ton cover into the air. Flames erupted into the night sky. A cloud of radioactive steam, invisible and silent, began to spread. The core was exposed. Firefighters, unaware of the true nature of the danger, rushed to the scene. The city slept on. In the control room, chaos reigned. Instruments failed. Alarms blared. Engineers argued. No one could believe what had happened. No one dared say the words, "The core is gone." Even as radiation levels skyrocketed, officials clung to disbelief. For those who had grown up in a regime where truth was molded to fit the party line, reality was not what you said, was what you were told to believe. By dawn, dozens of first responders were vomiting from acute radiation sickness. Their skin blistered, eyes burned. Still, orders were given to continue hosing down the reactor. There were no hazmat suits, no iodine tablets, just garden hoses and bravery. Inside the hospitals of Pripyat, the first signs of an invisible war began to show. Paramedics treated men who looked sunburnt and delirious. Children woke with metallic tastes in their mouths. Birds fell from the sky. Yet the government said nothing. The people of Pripyat, nearly 50,000 of them, made breakfast, sent their children to school, and waited for news that would never come. And above them, a ghost had begun to form. A specter of silence, of lies, of radiation that would cling to this place forever.
By the morning of April 26th, the horizon above reactor number 4 shimmered with a strange bluish glow, a phenomenon called Cherenkov radiation, caused by ionized air. For those who saw it, it looked almost beautiful, like a halo over the ruins. But beauty had never masked death so well. The explosion had released more radioactive material than both atomic bombs dropped on Japan combined. And yet, life in Pripyat continued, trapped inside a lie. Local officials received strict orders: do not cause panic, do not alert the public, do not evacuate. Trucks drove through the streets spraying water, as if this were a dust problem. Children played in sandboxes as particles of iodine-131 and cesium-137 drifted invisibly through the air. A wedding took place that morning just blocks from the reactor. No one was told the truth. At Chernobyl itself, the scale of the disaster was becoming undeniable. Helicopters were summoned to drop sand, boron, and lead into the gaping reactor, in a desperate attempt to smother the radioactive fire. Pilots flew without proper protection, knowing their missions were likely suicide runs. Many of them would die within weeks, but they flew anyway. By noon, hospitals were flooded with burn victims. Only these burns didn't come from heat. Doctors were unprepared. The word radiation was whispered, but never written down. Internal memos moved up the chain of command. But still, the public heard nothing. In Moscow, top Soviet officials argued behind closed doors. Admitting the scale of the catastrophe would embarrass the state. They needed time to manage the story. Science was no longer in control. Politics was. Back in Pripyat, teachers noticed strange symptoms in their students: nosebleeds, fatigue, nausea. And still, no announcement was made. Parents grew restless, staring out their windows toward the smoke rising in the distance. Radiation levels in parts of the city were thousands of times above normal, and no one had been warned. That evening, 36 hours after the explosion, the order finally came: evacuate. Loudspeakers crackled through the city, instructing residents to pack belongings for a short 3-day trip. Buses lined the streets. Families left pets behind. Most believed they'd be back by the weekend. They never returned. As the buses rolled out, a silence fell over Pripyat. Toys were left on the floor, food on the table, laundry in mid-dry. The city was frozen in time, a ghost town not yet dead, but already haunted. And still, the world knew nothing. That would change in Sweden. Over 1,000 kilometers away, workers at the Forsmark nuclear power plant noticed something strange. Radiation alarms were going off, but their own plant showed no signs of a leak. The contamination was coming from the east. Satellite imagery confirmed it. A massive release of radioactive material was drifting across Europe. The Soviet Union could no longer hide what had happened. On April 28th, nearly 3 full days after the explosion, the Soviet government finally issued a short statement admitting an incident at Chernobyl. The announcement was vague. It mentioned a fire. No mention of radiation, no death toll, no blame. But the lie had cracked, and behind it, the world was about to discover the most catastrophic nuclear disaster in human history. One that had been cloaked in silence, sealed by pride, and carried on the backs of people who were never meant to survive.
Across Europe, panic began to rise. Countries like Germany and Austria warned citizens to stay indoors. In Italy, people were told not to drink milk or eat leafy vegetables. Radiation had no borders. It rode on wind currents and settled silently over farmland, forests, and cities. Fallout maps showed the reach of the disaster stretching from Scandinavia to the Balkans. But the full truth was still shrouded behind the Iron Curtain. Inside the Soviet Union, the narrative was being carefully written. Official reports minimized the explosion. Experts were summoned to deliver statements filled with technical jargon and vague reassurances. State television showed cleanup efforts in heroic tones. Footage of comm workers and orderly evacuations masked the chaos on the ground. But for those at Chernobyl, the nightmare was far from over. The firefighters who had arrived within minutes of the explosion, many without any understanding of radiation, were now dying. Their bodies deteriorated rapidly. Skin sloughed off, organs failed. They were transferred to Hospital No. 6 in Moscow, a facility designated for radiological emergencies. Doctors tried to save them, but there was little that could be done. One by one, they succumbed. Their families weren't told the extent of the danger. Some were allowed to visit without protective gear. They hugged, kissed, and cried, exposing themselves to fatal doses of radiation without ever being warned. The Soviet state didn't issue a single public health advisory for these victims. At the reactor site, a new enemy emerged. The melted core had begun to sink into the earth. If it reached the water table, it could trigger a steam explosion that would make the initial blast look minor in comparison, wiping out much of Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia. A team of miners from Tula and Donetsk were summoned. They were told nothing about radiation, just that they had to dig a tunnel underneath the reactor to install a cooling system. They worked in extreme heat, often stripped to their waists. Air was thick with dust and radiation. There were no filters, no lead suits, just shovels and resolve. Many of them would die young. Some would never see the tunnel finished. Above ground, the reactor continued to smolder. A massive effort was launched to contain it. Over 600,000 people would eventually be mobilized: soldiers, scientists, workers, and civilians. They were called liquidators, tasked with decontaminating the area and sealing the reactor inside a concrete sarcophagus. Robots were initially deployed to clear radioactive debris from the reactor's roof, but most malfunctioned almost immediately. The radiation was too intense, so they sent men. They called them biorobots, clad in improvised lead armor, with only 90 seconds each to shovel debris and throw it over the edge. They sprinted across the scorched roof. Many collapsed afterward. The doses they received in less than 2 minutes would guarantee cancer, leukemia, or organ failure in the years to come. But they kept going. The Soviets did not allow photographs of the dead. No funerals were televised. No monuments raised. The sacrifice was buried in silence. Pripyat, meanwhile, stood empty. Homes decayed. Trees grew through sidewalks. The amusement park, scheduled to open on May 1st, stood still, its Ferris wheel, a rusting monument to lost innocence. Soldiers swept through, killing stray animals to prevent contamination. Entire villages in the surrounding 30-kilometer exclusion zone were evacuated, then bulldozed, burned, or buried. But the radiation didn't stop at the border. In Belarus, over 70% of the fallout landed, contaminating vast regions of farmland and forests. Children began to develop thyroid cancer at alarming rates. In Ukraine, families who had not yet been evacuated experienced symptoms: nausea, weakness, bleeding gums. But the Soviet response remained slow and incomplete. Evacuations were selective. Treatment was sparse. To the outside world, Chernobyl became a symbol of Soviet secrecy. But to those inside, it was a wound that never stopped bleeding, one that would deform their bodies, break their families, and silence their futures. And still, the full truth had not been told.
In the months following the explosion, Chernobyl disappeared from the headlines, but the suffering deepened. What began as a nuclear accident had become a multi-generational tragedy. The world had seen the smoke, the concrete, the official statements. What it hadn't seen was what the radiation did after the sirens stopped. In the countryside of Ukraine and Belarus, entire communities were uprooted. Over 350,000 people were relocated, forced to leave behind their homes, their histories, their dead. Many never received fair compensation. Some were moved into hastily constructed apartment blocks, others into temporary shelters. Their identity was erased. Their address became a number. Their past, a contamination risk. But many refused to leave. They were called the Samosli, the self-settlers. Mostly elderly villagers who returned to the exclusion zone after being evacuated. They preferred radiation to loneliness. They grew food from radioactive soil, drank contaminated water, and buried their dead with their own hands. They knew the risk. But to them, home was not a place on a map. It was sacred ground. Scientists began to study the long-term effects. Children born years after the explosion exhibited higher rates of cancer, developmental delays, and birth defects. Thyroid cancer, especially among those exposed as children, surged to unprecedented levels. Hospitals in Kiev and Minsk filled with tiny patients, many too young to understand what was happening to them. Some parents refused to accept the truth. Others clung to the hope that maybe, somehow, the government would help. But funding for treatment was inconsistent. Research was often censored. Doctors were pressured not to link diagnoses to the disaster. The official line remained: Chernobyl was under control. It wasn't. The sarcophagus built around reactor number 4 began to crack within a few years. Rainwater seeped inside. Radiation levels fluctuated dangerously. Birds nested in exposed beams. Radioactive dust hung in the air like a curse. Engineers warned of collapse. But repairs were delayed by bureaucracy, corruption, and the slow decay of a collapsing Soviet system. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. Ukraine inherited the ruins of Chernobyl, both physically and politically. The new government, overwhelmed by economic crisis and war, struggled to maintain the exclusion zone. Many of the liquidators who had survived were now sick, impoverished, and forgotten. They had served the state, but the state was gone, and still the ghosts remained. Ghosts of young men who had shoveled radioactive graphite with bare hands. Ghosts of children who played under a sky laced with iodine. Ghosts of decisions made in silence, of warnings ignored, of human life treated as expendable. As the 1990s wore on, international attention drifted elsewhere. But for those who lived with Chernobyl inside them, time didn't heal. It mutated. Survivors reported a kind of living death, a slow unraveling of health, memory, trust. Many were too sick to work, too poor to leave. Some took their own lives, others turned to alcohol. Depression and anxiety became epidemics of their own. Yet amid the pain, there was resistance. Whistleblowers emerged. Scientists who had seen the falsified reports. Doctors who had been ordered to keep silent. Parents who refused to accept that their children's suffering was statistically insignificant. They demanded truth, accountability, a future. But the system that created Chernobyl had vanished into history, leaving only ruins and records. Justice, like radiation, was invisible. And like the reactor core, it remained buried, too dangerous to fully uncover.
The silence of the Red Forest was unlike any other on Earth. Once lush and green, it now stood scorched and brown, trees killed in hours by the sheer intensity of radiation. The soil beneath remained poisoned, hot with isotopes that would outlive civilizations. And in the heart of this stillness, nature began to reclaim what humanity had abandoned. Wolves roamed the empty streets of Pripyat. Wild boars routed through apartment buildings. Mutated pine needles, oversized fungi, and insects resistant to decay became symbols of eerie adaptation. Some scientists marveled, calling it a strange ecological rebirth. Others warned that mutation did not mean recovery. The DNA of life itself had been scrambled, and no one knew the long-term cost. Yet, even in this wasteland, people returned. Tourists began to arrive in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Drawn by morbid curiosity and the myth of Chernobyl, they wandered through crumbling schoolhouses, stared at rusting Ferris wheels, and posed beside irradiated signs. What was once a site of tragedy was becoming spectacle, a dark pilgrimage into the ruins of the atomic age. But beneath the surface, danger persisted. Strontium-90, cesium-137, plutonium isotopes. These were not remnants of the past, they were the present. Airborne particles still drifted with every disturbance. Underground water remained tainted. Fires in the exclusion zone, some caused by lightning, others by scavenger scent, radioactive ash, back into the skies. Each blaze was a reminder, Chernobyl was never over. The psychological fallout endured too. In Ukraine and Belarus, entire generations grew up with a name that haunted every report card, every medical record, every government form: Chernobyl child. It was a label that meant contaminated, damaged, different. These children bore the legacy in their bodies, in weakened immune systems, in shortened lifespans, in the knowledge that their fates were decided before they were even born. Meanwhile, scientists and historians debated the true death toll. The official Soviet figure remained absurdly low, just 31 deaths, but independent studies told a darker story. Thousands had already died of cancer. Hundreds of thousands more would follow. Some estimates placed the number of eventual deaths in the hundreds of thousands, possibly more. But numbers failed to capture what was truly lost: mothers, fathers, children, futures. Chernobyl became a symbol, not just of nuclear disaster, but of deception, of failed systems, of the cost of lies. It was a lesson written in radioactive ink, etched across borders and decades. But even as the world swore never again, nuclear plants continued to operate under secrecy, profit, and risk. Then, in 2011, another shockwave: Fukushima. A tsunami had triggered another reactor meltdown, this time in Japan. A nation with vastly different governance, transparency, and technology. But the echoes were undeniable. As reactors exploded, evacuation zones expanded, and radiation monitors clicked to life. Memories of Chernobyl flooded the global consciousness once more. The same fears, the same reassurances, the same haunting question: have we learned anything? Back in Ukraine, efforts were finally underway to build a more permanent solution. The original sarcophagus, now crumbling and unstable, posed a new threat. International donors contributed to the construction of a massive steel structure, the new safe confinement. In 2016, the 36,000-ton dome was slid over the ruins of reactor No. 4. It was the largest movable structure ever built on land, a fortress designed to contain death for the next 100 years. But even this had a shelf life. Radiation does not forgive. It does not age or weaken like metal or memory. It waits. It persists. And so do the ghosts of Chernobyl, lingering, not just in the soil or the bones of survivors, but in the choices that allowed it to happen.
Years passed, but the shadow of Chernobyl never truly receded. In Ukraine, the name became a scar across the national identity, a reminder of both Soviet repression and the fragility of modern technology. Even as younger generations grew up with smartphones and independence, Chernobyl loomed as a kind of inherited trauma, something passed down, not just in stories but in blood. For the liquidators, those hundreds of thousands who had been sent to fight the invisible enemy, life after Chernobyl was rarely peaceful. Many suffered from chronic illnesses, heart failure, respiratory collapse, blood cancers. Some died in obscurity. Others formed associations, tried to document the cover-ups, lobbied for medical care that was often denied or delayed. They were once hailed as heroes by the state. Now, many lived in poverty, their medals gathering dust while their organs gave out. Government funding for survivors was cut during economic downturns. Protests were met with silence. The very people who had prevented a second explosion, who had shoveled radioactive debris with their bare hands, were discarded like relics of a past no one wanted to face. And then came a strange twist, hope in the unlikeliest form. Scientists began studying Chernobyl not just as a disaster site, but as a living laboratory. What happens to a world after humans abandon it? Wildlife returned in force. Lynx, wolves, deer, even bears roamed the forests and ghost towns. Some researchers claimed biodiversity was increasing, but others warned this was misleading. The absence of people did not mean the absence of radiation. It just meant the suffering had shifted. The ecosystem had adapted, but not healed. Then came the cultural resurgence. Books, films, and documentaries re-examined the disaster with renewed interest. In 2019, a dramatized HBO miniseries pulled Chernobyl into global conversation again, peeling back the layers of lies, fear, and human error. Millions watched, many for the first time learning how close the world had come to an even greater catastrophe. The show exposed the rot of Soviet bureaucracy, the heroism of ordinary people, and the unbearable cost of truth denied. In Pripyat, tourism spiked. Busloads of visitors snapped photos in front of peeling murals, stared into cracked mirrors, and walked through schoolrooms where chalk still clung to blackboards. Some came to honor, others came for the thrill. Few understood the weight of what lingered there. Guides wore dosimeters, clicking steadily as they moved through zones of higher radiation. Some areas were off limits entirely, but the boundary lines shifted. What was safe for an hour was deadly for a day. Nature had no warning signs. The danger was quiet, embedded in the moss, the dust, the air, and beneath it all, a new fear simmered. As climate change intensified, wildfires became more frequent in Eastern Europe. When they reached the exclusion zone, they didn't just burn trees, they released stored radiation back into the atmosphere. Smoke plumes carried cesium and strontium across borders again. Chernobyl wasn't just a past event. It was a ticking clock, disturbed by every storm, every spark, every careless match. And then came 2022. When Russian troops invaded Ukraine, they moved through the Chernobyl exclusion zone in the early hours of the assault. Military convoys stirred up radioactive dust. Soldiers dug trenches in contaminated soil, oblivious to the danger. Reports later confirmed radiation spikes during the occupation. The ghosts of Chernobyl were disturbed again, not by science, not by nature, but by war. The irony was brutal. The site that had once symbolized the failure of an empire was now the battleground for another. Chernobyl became more than a disaster zone. It was a front line, a metaphor, a cursed land caught in the crosshairs of history once more. Because Chernobyl was never just about a reactor. It was about truth buried, life wasted, and how long a lie can outlast the people who believed in it.
Beneath the reactor ruins, entombed under steel and concrete, lies a substance born of catastrophe, the elephant's foot, formed from molten core material, sand, metal, and graphite. It is one of the most dangerous objects on Earth. In 1986, mere minutes near it meant certain death. Even now, decades later, it hums with lethal radiations, lower, quieter, but no less haunting. It's not just a relic of disaster, it's a monument to the raw, uncontainable force mankind tried to master and failed. The image of the elephant's foot became a blurry photo taken by a robot too damaged to function properly. The man who eventually photographed it by hand died soon after. This was what Chernobyl created, things so toxic, they couldn't even be seen without cost. And yet, it wasn't just material that had to be buried. It was accountability, conscience. Entire truths were locked inside sarcophagi of secrecy. In the years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, classified documents slowly leaked. Transcripts from emergency meetings, testimonies from plant operators, memos buried by party leaders. They revealed what many suspected, that Chernobyl wasn't a surprise. Warnings about the reactor design dated back years. Engineers had raised concerns. Scientists had flagged dangers. But each time, those warnings were smothered under the weight of ideology. The Soviet system prized image over insight, obedience over truth. Chernobyl was the logical conclusion, not an anomaly, but the natural result of silencing knowledge to preserve power, and in the decades since, other nations have repeated the same patterns, denying problems, covering up incidents, downplaying risk in the name of economic progress. The specter of Chernobyl lingers, not because it was uniquely Soviet, but because it was uniquely human. Back in Ukraine, a new generation has grown up in the shadow of the zone. Some see it as a national wound, others as a cautionary tale. A few have made it their life's work to monitor the site, to measure radiation, to preserve its history. They walk among cracked reactors and rusted signs with solemn duty, not fear. These are the guardians of memory, scientists, engineers, archivists working quietly to ensure the mistakes of 1986 are not repeated. But memory is fragile. In nearby villages, elders still remember the taste of the air that night, the metal temps, the burning in the throat. They remember how the wind shifted, how the dogs howled, how the buses came too late. Some whisper stories of glowing animals, of forests that sang, of children who grew too quickly, or not at all. These stories blur the line between fact and folklore, between science and ghost story, because Chernobyl is haunted in every sense of the word, haunted by what was lost, by what was hidden, and by what can never be undone. Documentaries and studies continue, but some truths remain elusive. No one will ever know the exact death toll. No one will ever measure the full psychological damage. Numbers don't capture the father who watched his daughter waste away, or the soldier who knew, the moment he stepped onto the reactor roof, that his life had been halved. What survives, instead, are traces, isotopes, in the soil. Empty shoes in an abandoned classroom. A doll's head beneath a window. These fragments speak more loudly than official reports ever could. Chernobyl was not just a failure of a reactor. It was the failure to protect the most sacred thing of all, life.
In the radioactive silence of Chernobyl's exclusion zone, time bends. Buildings stand as if waiting for a return that will never come. A child's tricycle rusts in a hallway. A piano gathers dust in a school auditorium. Personal belongings, books, coats, photographs, remain untouched, as if someone simply stepped out for a moment and forgot to come back. But no one does, and no one will. The passage of time has not erased the pain. It has only layered it with a veneer of distance. Beneath that stillness lies the memory of a world ripped open, not by war, not by nature, but by human error wrapped in bureaucratic indifference. Chernobyl is not a frozen moment. It's a wound that pulses quietly across generations. The families affected never truly found closure. Many were told nothing, no cause of death, no compensation, no acknowledgement. In Belarus, entire villages were erased from the map. Cancer became a quiet epidemic. Pregnancies ended in silence. Marriages crumbled under the weight of fear and grief. The survivors were not just victims of radiation, but of abandonment. Even those who didn't live near the reactor felt the ripple. Farmers in rural Germany, hundreds of miles away, destroyed contaminated crops. Fishermen in Scandinavia lost entire seasons of income. Children in Northern Europe were banned from playing outside. Mothers were told to throw away breast milk. Chernobyl didn't just poison land. It poisoned trust in institutions, in science, in the idea of control. Governments scrambled to assure citizens the levels were safe, the situation was stable, the worst was over. But the public had learned a devastating truth. What they were told and what was real were rarely the same. In Ukraine, the zone became paradoxical. forbidden, yet alluring, dangerous, yet peaceful. It symbolized both a failure of mankind and the resilience of nature. Trees split cracked pavement. Vines climbed the walls of apartment blocks. Without human interference, the land began to breathe again. But it breathed differently, shaped by isotopes, haunted by decay. Tourism brought economic opportunity, but also ethical questions. Should tragedy be packaged and sold? Was it right to turn suffering into spectacle? Some guides approached the work with reverence, honoring the stories of those who had lived and died there. Others offered thrills, radioactive selfies, scavenger hunts in ruins. The line between remembrance and exploitation blurred. For scientists, the zone became a unique, if terrifying, research environment. Studies on genetic mutation, radiation resistance, and environmental recovery attracted global attention. Some discoveries were remarkable. Fungi that feed on radiation, animals adapting in ways no one predicted. But every revelation came with an asterisk, the unspoken cost in human lives that made such research possible. Meanwhile, the political symbolism of Chernobyl deepened. For Russia, it remained a cautionary ghost, a lesson in the fragility of empires. For Ukraine, it became a national scar that marked the break from Moscow's control. For the world, it stood as a grim reminder that the line between safety and disaster is always thinner than we think. That one overlooked warning, one miscalculation, one decision made under pressure can unravel the stability of nations. And yet, despite everything, the world did not turn away from nuclear power. Reactors still operate across the globe, some older than Chernobyl's. Debates rage over climate change, energy independence, and technological innovation. And once again, politics often drowns out caution. The lessons of 1986 are cited, but not always followed. Chernobyl remains. Not just as a place, but as a mirror. A place where the past is still alive, where science and superstition walk side by side, where the air holds memory, and the ground tells stories of what happens when we place systems above people, progress above truth.
In the early hours after the explosion, as alarms blared and radiation levels surged, it wasn't science that failed first, it was communication. The truth had to pass through a filter of obedience, where reality was rewritten to fit the expectations of those in power. And so, for critical hours and days, no one outside Chernobyl knew, not the citizens of Pripyat, not the doctors who treated the dying, not the world. And what followed was denials, strategic, intentional, deadly. Soviet news outlets downplayed the accident. Maps erased contaminated zones. Radiation sickness was diagnosed as stress. Internal memos warned doctors not to use the word Chernobyl in medical reports. Even as children collapsed in classrooms and firemen bled from their mouths, officials refused to admit what had happened. That silence didn't just kill, it mutated. It infected institutions and echoed outward through generations. Survivors were told they were imagining symptoms. Parents were blamed for birth defects. Whistleblowers were discredited or disappeared. Entire regions were declared safe, repopulated, then evacuated again. Trust became radioactive. For many, the aftermath of Chernobyl wasn't one explosion, it was a slow erosion of health, of memory, of voice. But some voices refused to vanish. Journalists, scientists, and survivors fought to be heard, even at great personal cost. In 1987, Soviet physicist Valery Legasov, the man who had helped lead the initial response, took his own life. But before he died, he recorded a series of tapes exposing the truth, the reactor design flaws, the bureaucratic obstruction, the willful blindness. His revelations ignited fury and reform, but also came too late for many. Others picked up where he left off. Historian Svetlana Alexievich published Voices from Chernobyl, a raw, heartbreaking oral history built from the testimonies of ordinary people, the widows, the doctors, the liquidators, the children. Their words carried what data could not: the emotional truth of disaster, fear soaked into skin, hope shattered like glass, love poisoned by fallout. And slowly, those voices pierced the silence. They reached classrooms, documentaries, newsrooms, parliaments. They changed safety protocols, sparked debates, inspired art and literature. And for a brief moment, the world listened. But silence has a way of creeping back in. In recent years, even as interest in Chernobyl resurged through media and tourism, global attention has drifted again. Funding for survivor support programs has dwindled. Medical monitoring has slowed. Younger generations, especially outside of Europe, know the name but not the weight. The ghost of silence waits patiently. It always does. And still, the radiation lingers. In Pripyat, it's in the dust that coats children's books left behind. In the basements flooded with radioactive groundwater. In the soil where moss grows over forgotten shoes. Time does not clean it. Only truth can. Because Chernobyl is not just history, it's a living argument about who gets to speak and who is silenced. About the cost of obedience and the price of truth. About how long a warning can echo before we hear it.
The winds still pass through the empty streets of Pripyat, rattling broken windows and stirring curtains left undrawn. Decades have passed, but the air remembers. Somewhere deep in reactor number 4, sealed under layers of concrete and steel, the core of the disaster still sleeps. Not dead. Contained. Ticking. Chernobyl did not end in 1986. It began. It began the moment truth became negotiable, when safety was measured not in lives protected, but in appearances maintained. It began when experts were ignored, and warnings buried beneath layers of pride and fear. And what emerged from that reactor was not just radiation. It was a blueprint for disaster in an age where humanity dances on the edge of technologies it barely understands. The scars are everywhere. In Belarus, children still undergo annual thyroid checks before they understand why. In Ukraine, thousands live with Chernobyl ID cards, granting access to hospitals and haunting reminders of what their bodies carry. Across Europe, in sealed laboratories and locked archives, scientists still trace isotopes to April 1986. Radioactive ghosts embedded in bone, in soil, in rain. Yet in the ashes, something else emerged. Courage. The kind born not from orders, but from instinct. The firefighters who drove into flames they couldn't see. The helicopter pilots who flew straight into radioactive clouds. The miners who dug beneath a melting core, knowing every breath was borrowed. The scientists who gave up their careers and lives to tell the truth. These were not heroes cast by the state. They were ordinary people, faced with impossible choices, who did what they could. Because when institutions fail, people remain. They carry stories, names, evidence. They rebuild meaning from ruins. The Chernobyl diaspora, survivors, evacuees, descendants, have kept the memory alive, even as the world forgets. Their bodies are archives. Their grief, unspoken testimony. They are the living proof that Chernobyl wasn't just an accident. It was a betrayal. And now, the zone watches. Its silence isn't empty. It warns. It teaches. But it does not forgive. Forests thrive, but their roots clutch secrets. Rivers flow, but their fish carry microscopic legacies. The wildlife returns, but with changes no one fully understands. Nature has reclaimed the land, but not its innocence. In the end, Chernobyl is a mirror. It reflects what happens when science is shackled by secrecy, when progress outruns morality, when systems place power over people. It asks not just how such a thing could happen, but how easily it could again. It reminds us that the greatest danger lies not in machines, but in the hands that control them. And now, we are those hands. In an age of accelerating climate change, geopolitical instability, and advanced technology, the world stands on another precipice. The lessons of Chernobyl are more urgent than ever, not just about reactors and radiation, but about responsibility, transparency, and the unbearable cost of silence. The sirens have long faded, the fires extinguished, but the story is not over. It lives on, in the earth, in the sky, and in the haunted edges of memory. Chernobyl is not just a place on a map. It's a warning carved into time, and it is still waiting to be heard.